highlining is great. It teaches you so much about the ego. It teaches you so much about being present in the moment, but it is not a therapist, and it should never replace a therapist. And I think a lot of people think it does.
Welcome to recoverHER, the podcast where your healing journey begins. I'm Heather Novak, and I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Tracy Oppenheim, a compassionate psychiatrist. Today, we embark on a path of recovery and self-discovery. We are dedicated to inspiring each and every one of you to overcome your struggles and live your best, most fulfilling life. Your recovery starts now, and we're here with you every step of the way.
It's only up from here, 'cause there's no one else that's me.
Well, welcome back to another episode of recoverHER.
Welcome back.
Yes, here with Faith Dickey. And I'm so fired up to be exploring healing, transformation, and the courage it takes to create a life of authenticity and freedom. And I thought there was no one better to represent all of those things than Faith. She's a professional highliner, a world record holder, a pioneer in the sport of highlining. And her journey is one of defying gravity, fear, both on the line and in life. For me, her story offers profound insights in terms of things I'm very passionate about: resilience, focus, what it takes to face challenges head on, whether they're physical, mental, or emotional. And then as a geeky psychiatrist, the cerebellum is deeply tied to emotional health. So welcome, Faith.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us how you got into your particular sport.
So first, let me tell you what highlining is, just for maybe your listeners who don't know what you're talking about. It's kind of easiest to envision it like tightrope walking, but it's a little bit different than tightrope walking. It's less circus-based, and it's much more tied to outdoor sports like rock climbing. So essentially, you are, balancing on a rope strung between 2 points. The difference is in highlining, this rope is flat and stretchy. It kind of moves like a rubber band in a way. And so you don't use a pole to balance like a tightrope walker. I actually use my arms and sort of different posture to stay balanced on the line. And the line moves and sways. And I'm essentially trying to stay balanced on top of it and calm it down. And I practice highlining anywhere from 50 feet off the ground to 4,000 feet off the ground. Really depends on the terrain, but most often I do it between mountains and rocky outcrops and canyons. So that's what highlining is. And probably a lot of people right now are like, why the hell would anyone do that?
We're both moms, and it was a few years ago that, maybe a decade ago, that I started seeing people tie these lines in between trees in their front yard or their backyard, wherever they happen to be, if they had space for that. And, kids are the most agile. Their bodies can move in ways that our aging ones have seemed to have forgotten. So I applaud any kind of youthful play that's back. But I remember being so curious and watching that. And then how we found you, Faith, was pretty extraordinary, because if everybody hasn't had the experience to do a demo inside of, this isn't an ad for Apple products by any means, but we did do a demo with the Apple Vision Pro right before Christmas. And your video it was immersive, and we were with you walking. I think you tell us about that.
I went to Norway and highlined over the fjords, 4,000 feet high. And so it's the first time highlining has been filmed in an immersive way. And so, what's so unique too about that? And like, Apple is not paying me any more money now. So I'm also not just plugging Apple. And actually, I was kind of skeptical of it at first. It was a highline job for me. And of course, it was cool to think about it being filmed immersively, but I had no idea what it was going to be like until I got to see it. And then I was like, holy shit, this is actually really cool.
I had a physiologic response to the experience. Like I got a little surge of adrenaline. And I was
I think there were some nauseous feelings that came up because you really feel like we are with you.
Yes. And that's what's so cool is with the Apple Vision, you can look around, so you get this 180-degree view. A lot of people imagine immersive movies to be like point of view, like you're looking through my eyes. And I explain to people like, no, it's like you're hanging out on the cliff and you're right next to me in the sky while I'm walking, and you can look around and look down at what's below my feet and look what's behind me. It's just so unusual and such a crazy way to see it.
So I did a little bit of rabbit holing on you because I was just like, this is amazing because I'm really interested in mindset.
Yeah, we got a little obsessed.
Really into this idea that we put so many limitations on ourselves, and we need to make friends with fear and challenge ourselves. So I understand you grew up in Austin. Okay. And then were you just, what was your personality like as a kiddo? Was this something that was aligned with your hardwiring, or was this learned?
We'll have to be careful not to go on so many tangents during this conversation, because the story has so many like points we could jump off from and talk about other things. But I don't think any of us can super accurately reflect on our own personalities as children, right? We can just sort of try to look back and imagine who we were then based on what we were experiencing. And I grew up with a lot of trauma. And so I think at a young age, I learned to kind of disassociate in some degrees, but also to just like compartmentalize things that were happening around me. And I also didn't have control over my own environment as a child. And so, and I was really fortunate. I went to a Waldorf school, if anyone knows what that is. So I was in this really amazing community, and that was the most stable thing I had in my childhood. And the caveat of that being that I was in a very small classroom where it was very hard to be an exceptional student because you're only with, a very tiny class. And so I never really grew up standing out in any way in my classroom setting. I was a good artist, but so were half the other 20 kids in my class. And I was never like the best student. I was just sort of in the middle. So I never was like maybe trying to achieve too much as a child, but I definitely was excited about climbing trees. And it's a term I feel like is luckily working its way out of culture now, but I was a tomboy in the sense that like I liked to play football with the boys, and I liked to, I wasn't a girly girl growing up. I kind of liked the tough things. I liked climbing trees. I liked building forts. I liked doing things. And at the same time, I also loved art and creative pursuits that were quiet. And I was really into, I had a big imagination as a kid. So I'd spend a lot of time sort of lost in my own head. But I grew up in Austin, like there's not mountains there. And I wasn't, I didn't have access to climbing. I did the very most basic sports like volleyball and basketball in middle school and high school. I wasn't an exceptional athlete by any means. So finding slacklining was kind of a series of chance events. I was headed to fashion school. I was 18. I come from a single parent home. We grew up on welfare. Like there was no money for me to go to school. And going to this private school, I was surrounded by people who had money to go to school. And so I think I didn't really realize how different it would be for me when I reached that point. Like no one was telling me like, hey, Faith, you're the poor kid. You're going to have a hard time. It was like, follow your dreams. And so it was a really rude awakening when I got accepted to these schools and then couldn't pay for them. And so I had a lot of drive, and, something I'm very grateful to my mom for was like seeing my mom work really hard, also with no boundaries and no ability to take care of herself. But she did at least instill in me like good work ethic, like you work hard for what you want to achieve. And so I was like, I'm going to work hard and go to school and follow my dreams. And so I was working 80 hours a week. Took a gap year. I was working 5 different jobs. I just like collected all these different jobs. I was a nanny. I was a paintball referee. I worked at restaurants and pubs. I did like everything. And I was saving money so I could go to New York and study fashion. And I was also 19, and I was trying to have a social life. This is a very long-winded answer, I'm realizing. But I was driving home one evening, fell asleep driving my car on the way home because I was just so exhausted. And I flipped my car over, and I was unscathed, super lucky. But I just suddenly was like, what am I doing? Like, I'm 19. I have very little world experience. Like, what if this isn't the path for me? I'm going to go to school and have all this debt and be like chained to this job. Like, what if that doesn't work out? And so it was just a really big wake up call. And so I kind of shed half of these jobs I had and started going to a park in Austin, like almost every day. And I would just go and like read a book and swim. And there was a slack line, which is highlining low on the ground. It's just between trees, a few feet above the ground. And it was set up between trees. And there was this hot guy doing it, and he turned out to be really crazy. Totally other story for another podcast. But there was this hot guy slacklining, and I was like, I should go try that and see what it's about. And the first time I tried it, I thought, like, that's impossible. Like, I couldn't take a single step. And so I just kind of like brushed it off and continued to hang out at the park, when I wasn't working in the evenings. And another day I was there and I was like, okay, I'll give it another go. I'm here, I'm by myself. And that day I took a step, like one step.
What'd that feel like?
It was amazing. And it just was so amazing because slacklining, be it low on the ground or high in the sky, you have to really concentrate to do it, especially when you're learning to do it. Like once you're really skilled, you can like talk to someone while you do it. But in the beginning, you can't talk to anybody. Like you have to just lock in. And it felt so good. I had all these like kind of big problems in my life I couldn't solve. Like, my mom has mental illness and did for my entire childhood. And like, I couldn't afford to go to school. Like there were all these sort of big kind of crises things in the back of my mind, and it just melted away. And I just got this like moment of pure concentration, and it felt like a vacation.
I'm visualizing you. How many years ago was this?
16?
16 years ago, taking one step. And
Yes.
it reminds me of it's a beautiful metaphor for life, of just putting one foot in front of the other, one step at a time. Because we so often talk about, well, maybe you're not qualified to do this, or you don't know how to do this. And the bottom line that kind of makes you a winner is that you just start.
My own story is such a reminder to me, and I'm sure to other people too, that sometimes you never know what this little moment in life is actually going to lead you to. And I feel like too, now that I'm older, I think the beautiful thing about being younger is that sometimes we don't spend so much time thinking what if, or like, I don't have time for that, or that's meaningless, or that's, frivolous or whatever. Like when you're young and you're a teenager and in your 20s, you're like, fuck it, I'm just going to do it. And like that little experience literally made my life do a 180, and I completely went down another path. And, it's like even now, like with a busy life and running a business and all these things, it's like I feel like it's so easy to encounter something and be like, I don't have time for that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you still have that curiosity that you had back then, 16 years ago, when you first took one step, could balance and thought that was really big? Do you still have that same level of awe and curiosity about slacklining, regardless of the height that you're walking on? I mean, I guess my question is, does it clear your brain? Because there are two activities that I can think of that where I completely go offline. Otherwise, this motherfucker is always going. It's like the monkey mind is always going, even in my meditation, which I've learned that to kind of accept that meditation is just those thoughts that are coming. It's simply stress leaving my body. But and it doesn't happen all the time in the yoga rooms. I've practiced for over 25 years, but sometimes in a certain asana, I'll be so in the flow. And then when I'm fly fishing, which is so random, I don't get to do it very often, but I love it. And I will be out there casting a line and throwing a double haul for 8 hours, and somebody will have to come and pull me off the river. And I lose all track of time. Does that still happen to you, where all of the big problems dissipate?
In a lesser way. So now that I've been slacklining and highlining for so long, I'm very desensitized. So it's similar to like what I mentioned, where once you get good at it, you can like talk to someone while you do it. So it's like the more, I feel like at some point, like I'm so used to it that the other things in life can find their way in easier. It's not as much of a meditation. But at the same time, I always feel better after I go slacklining. So it's like there's still a reward. In some ways, I've told people like I feel in a way that I've learned all I can from slacklining itself, but I learned a lot from it, you know? And so it's like, yes. And it's been like this whole life journey. And I feel like now, I get a lot of what I used to get from slacklining from rock climbing because I rock climbed. I didn't rock climb as much in the beginning. I slacklined and highlined much more. And rock climbing was like the side thing I did just to get to the top of things to put up the slackline. And so I feel like now I get lost when I'm climbing. Like I just notice I come down from a climb and I'm like, oh, I didn't think about any of the big problems of life while I was up there, you know? Whereas like highlighting, I'm a bit desensitized. Like there's moments where I'm thinking about all my to-dos while I'm out there.
You mentioned a lot of early childhood trauma, and so we know the impact that that can have on uh, our nervous systems. It can change the relationship we have with our bodies. There can be like a tendency to dissociate, and it's so interesting that you gravitated towards something that, so from a physiologic standpoint, you probably know more about this than I do, but when you are on the slack line, definitely on the high line, and they've actually done EEG studies where they've looked at people's brain waves while they're doing these things.
Oh, wow.
And same thing showing up as in meditation. And then also you're so hyper focused, and then there's this connection with your amygdala, so your fear center, and then your cerebellum, which I know most people think is just for balance, but the same way it helps you balance, it also helps you balance emotionally with regulation. Did it change your ability to process your trauma, or did it change your relationship in terms of how you felt in your body?
I think the best way I could answer that is that I noticed at some point in my 20s, kind of in the like peak time that I was highlining a lot, that it changed the things I stressed out about. So it didn't give me any like relationship tools. I had to learn those the hard way by having messed up relationships and going to therapy. But in regards to, I would just notice that I would be around people who hadn't done any highlining or any sports that were similar, and they just seem to get like really stressed about a lot of little things. And I just feel like, like highlining is actually very stressful. And every time you get on a highline, you're doing this practice where you're calming your body down while it's trying to get into like a fight or flight mode. And so that practice made it so that there were just kind of like, like things would happen, like a flight would get canceled, or I'm trying to like think of real world examples, right? And I was just like, whatever. Like it just didn't seem like a big deal to me. And I was in a second car accident actually, and I don't know what this says about me, but I have been in two car accidents where I flipped a car over. The first one was falling asleep that I mentioned, and the second one was hitting ice when I was like driving back to Texas to see family. And my first reaction as the car started losing control was like, I just F bomb, F bomb, F bomb, like, oh my God, I'm, about to get in a car accident. And like, it was time slowed down, and I realized like I'm sliding. I was going 70 miles an hour. There's nothing I can do. And I just relaxed. I just thought like, Faith, you might be in the hospital after this. And then I thought, Faith, you might not be here after this. And I just let go. I just like let it happen. And I really attribute my ability to relax in that situation to all the highlining I'd done and the constant training of calming my body down when it was trying to get into fight or flight mode. And I really think because of that, I didn't get injured. Like the car rolled and I like went like
this ability to surrender. Was there at different points in your career and relationship with the sport, were you ever misusing it as a way to avoid or disconnect or like adrenaline
Adrenaline
seeking?
junkie, numbing yourself out. Have you ever abused it on that level?
Well, I used to always get mad at like news articles that would call it an adrenaline sport because I was like, hey, the whole point of this is that we're trying to not have adrenaline, like we're trying to get into this meditative state. But that doesn't mean you can't be addicted to the intensity of it.
Mm.
So even though your brain is kind of in a parasympathetic because you're just really locked in.
I was really chasing this feeling where I wasn't narrating the experience around me, where I was like, it is kind of like a heightened meditative state where you know everything that's going on around you and you can still respond to it, but there's not a voice in your head telling you what's happening. And I would only achieve this for like moments at a time, but it felt so good. And I wanted to be in that space. And and like I mentioned with slacklining, even if I'm not having a bunch of adrenaline, you know, emitted in my body, it's still a distraction from these kind of painful emotional things that I might have to face otherwise. And so I left the country when I was 20. I went to Europe to travel. That's where I started highlining, so doing it high off the ground. And, I was hooked right away. And the whole lifestyle, everything about it, traveling nonstop, like going from one destination to another, being in mountains and these kind of extreme environments. I mean, it was all incredible, no regrets, but like I didn't have to face these sort of painful emotional things related to my mother and like, family life that I didn't want to deal with. And perhaps my own pain just based on my childhood too. I didn't have to really face it.
And it may have been that at that time your system wasn't ready to.
Mhm.
I always say like it's way better that I found highlining than drugs or alcohol. Like if you're going to pick an addiction, at least like an extreme sport means you're going to probably be pretty fit and like see extraordinary places. So in that regard, I'm happy that I did find it and I learned a lot. So it's not all bad, that I was hooked on it. I think that maybe the trajectory I see that can happen is you get older and you start to learn that you're using it in not an entirely healthy way and you change your relationship to it. And there's people I see, not just in highlining, but in base jumping or rock climbing who don't, and I see them getting older, still having dysfunctional relationships, still just like going so hard in these activities, hurting their bodies doing it. And to me, it's like, I feel like part of growing up was figuring out balance, not just on the line, but balance in life. And some people don't, they stay imbalanced because they don't want to face those things.
And I think there's so much like insight. You got to write a book, right?
Mm.
If you haven't already. I think it's so tricky to discern that balance because that can be true with anything.
Yes, work, being a parent. I mean, it can apply to everything. And for so long too, I think me and the friends I was highlighting with all the time, we thought we were so immune to these sort of normal human problems because we were living this unusual life, that was so cool. And actually what awakened me to all of this was getting injured because I didn't learn self-care. I didn't have health insurance. I didn't know when to stop and rest. And so I got injuries and just pushed through them. And eventually, like I destroyed my knees to the point where it was so painful to highline that I had to stop. Like I literally had to stop. And I went through such a crisis of identity. I was like, who am I? Then like some of my world records started to get passed. And, I'd always said like the world records kind of happened by accident. Like I was just very driven and there weren't that many women doing it. And I was just like going for it. And so in a way, the world records were kind of just an opportunity I fell into. And I was always like, I want other women to pass me because I don't like, I want it to mean that other women are doing these things. But when I actually lost some records, it was a different thing. I was like, oh my God, who am I? Yeah. And it was painful to suddenly feel so worthless. And I had built all of my self-worth on these achievements. And so without them, I felt like a nobody. And so I really went through this kind of rock bottom at the, in kind of middle 20s. I guess it was like 26, 27, 28. And I, didn't have all my records anymore. I got knee surgery. I didn't feel the same way about highlining because I'd put so much pressure on myself to achieve that I couldn't just go highline for the sake of highlining. And it was my job. And so there was kind of blurred lines between, am I doing this because I want to or doing this because I have to? And so it's just like what started out as like really a pure thing and a pure drive became very muddled. And I had to kind of like figure out if I wanted to highline again and who was I without it. And actually I'm glad I went through all of that. I'm much more well adjusted and well rounded now. It also created space in my life to work on my mental health outside of highlining. And like what I try to say without sounding too old and curmudgeon-y when I'm around younger highliners is like, highlining is great. It teaches you so much about the ego. It teaches you so much about being present in the moment, but it is not a therapist, and it should never replace a therapist. And I think a lot of people think it does.
Yeah, I think
That's
we
a
want
good
to
point.
use all these tools to support our healing, but that's something that Heather and I talk about quite often. Is there seems to have been this bashing of the traditional psychotherapy, and I think it's more about having, like I like to say, just who's on your team, not only from a person standpoint, but also from an activity standpoint that's supporting your mental health. But I'm not. I don't know why. We've just been so. The pendulum has swung so far the other way. At some point, you did some free solo.
Yes.
And that made me stop breathing for a second. Like, tell me about the decision to pursue that. Is that something you still do?
So free soloing which is walking the high line with no harness or tether attaching you to the line. It started out as, when in my very beginnings of highlinings, I couldn't understand why anyone would do it. There was only a handful of people doing it, and I thought it was absolutely stupid. But as I just gained a lot of proficiency in highlining, I started to think like, the only thing stopping me from walking this without a leash is my mind. Like having the leash attaching your harness to the line doesn't make the line easier to walk in any physical way. And so, granted, I was 20 years old, but I also was like so curious about that. Like, I wanted to believe that my mind wasn't this separate thing controlling me. I wanted to feel like I was in control of my mind, that my mind was serving me. And so free soloing for me was exploring that space of what is my mind stopping me from doing. And if I can walk this all day back and forth with a harness, why is it different when I take the harness off? And so, yeah, and it makes you realize all the things that our minds stop us from doing, or some part of our minds, right? And it's like we drive around in cars all the time under the assumption that nothing's going to happen. But like, actually, we're never fully in control when we're driving a car because there's other cars and it's a machine, whereas like on a highline, in actuality, I'm totally in control. And, of course, that's like omitting some really freak scenario where like a gust of wind comes in the middle of the day when it's not forecasted. Like, so far that hasn't happened. So aside from like acts of God, I'm in control. It's a very controlled experiment. And then as I continued to solo and solo more and more, I was always terrified. It was always scary. So even if I wasn't scared with a harness and a leash, when I would take the leash off, I was scared again. And so it was clear that, my mind knew that the risk was so much higher. Even if, one part of my consciousness was like, Faith, you're totally able to do this. This is easy physically. Some other part of my mind was like, you could die. And that part of my mind never went away. And so I started to kind of use it as a way to examine intuition. So when I was sitting there on the cliff about to get on the line free solo, I would feel scared and I would try to like really look inside of myself and peer at that fear and try to figure out if it was something more, if it was some really deep knowing that was saying, don't do this, not today, this isn't a good idea? Or is it just fear saying, I'm scared, I'm scared, I'm scared? And I think we don't have a ton of opportunities to explore that space in everyday life and, our pretty like comfortable existence. And so I was really intrigued by it. And I haven't like come to some conclusion, but I do think that I'm a little bit better at noticing the difference between fear and intuition, like recognizing a gut feeling versus fear, because they're not actually the same.
It's a cool way that you just described kind of evaluating and looking closer to the nuance inside of all of those feelings of what it's trying to tell you, instead of so often just honoring, well, I'm fearful or I'm feeling anxious or whatever it may be. You're doing that from what I heard you say, but you're also kind of evaluating why. Your fear to someone that's never done slacklining or highlining for that matter seems very rational, right? You're not numbing it out or trying to quiet it. You're recognizing that it's
Yes.
there and then going the step further, because we often say that, like, when do you do you feel the feeling sadness and just simply feel it? Or do we have to go into, why am I feeling so sad? And it seems like you're able to do both.
Yeah, I think doing both is really important, and highlighting at least, because sometimes you just need to accept that there's fear, because the fear, even noticing that it's fear and not some deeper knowing, it doesn't make the fear go away. Some part of my mind recognizes that without a leash, if something goes wrong, death is a potential. And so, like, so far, at least, I haven't been able to get rid of that. And I actually don't want to, because I think fear is important to have. It teaches us where the edges are. It is a learning tool. And like, I don't want to abuse that in a way. Like, I want to keep my fear as a friend. And so I don't want it to dictate my choices, but I want it to be there. And so I think, I do still free solo. I think the last time I soloed was last year. But I've slowed down a lot. Like, it definitely correlated to probably being really kind of hooked on the intensity of highlining. But also it was a pursuit I felt like I needed in the past. And I just don't feel like I need it as much anymore. Like, there's not as much value for me. And so even now I question, not only do I go through this evaluation of, is this intuition? I go through this evaluation of, do I even want to do this?
I'm someone that felt much safer being in my head, for the majority of my life. And I've kind of dedicated these last 10 years just to getting out of my head into the body and leaning into more discomfort and really just getting curious about these like limiting beliefs that I see in all of us,
right,
frankly.
It's such bullshit. What a time waster. We're here. We have this one precious wild life that we have no idea when it's going to end. So say yes.
So I'm curious, for the people that you work with, like, say for someone like me, right? Like, where I feel uncomfortable in nature. And but I have this like strong desire to be in nature. So it's like really like this weird thing. So I have offered myself the opportunity to be more in nature, and it's challenging for me, just like some really basic shit, honestly. But I know it's good for me. And we were supposed to go to Havasu High Falls, and
about the Grand Canyon.
And I fucking lost my mind because I was like, I don't know, and I'm very fit, right? Like, so I know, like, rationally, I'm a very fit human, but I'm like, I don't know if I could do that, like, 10-mile hike in and out. And Heather's like, what is wrong with you? But it was this idea of being so out of control. So practicing surrender is really important. And then even, I'm not scared of heights per se, but when that anxiety kicks up, your vestibular system for sure gets involved, right? Where things seem, it's easier to feel dizzy and things like that. I think it would be so good for me to be out there and then just fucking fall, Right. And see that I'm okay. So I'm curious from your perspective when you're working with someone with my kind of mentality versus someone that's like in their comfort zone, what transformation do you see or what takeaways do they have from spending time with you and being part of your company and having those experiences?
I mean, yeah, you mentioned that I smiled because I think part of what I'm so passionate about now, like so much of my passion in the beginning was about my own experience, and now I feel a lot of passion about other people's experience and being able to share what I've learned from my own journey with heights and highlining. Um, I think what I really try to do with people, so I have this highline setup that enables anyone to walk a highline with zero experience. So essentially, you have two ropes to hold on to in your hands, and you're attached to a rope above yourself, too. And so it's so cool because you get to still be out in that space, but you don't have to train slacklining for a year to come do it. So what I really do is it kind of depends on people's different levels of fear, but a lot of times I use a strategy of helping people get in their bodies. I too have do still do, but have spent so much time in my head my whole life, and it's still to this day is, I'm when I did therapy, for example, like so much of I did EMDR therapy with my therapist, and so much of that is about like, she would ask me like, where do you feel it in your body, and it would always take me so long to figure it out. Yeah, I'm like in my brain where it's supposed to be. And so I know how limiting that can be when you're just like up here chatting. And so like I'll do exercises with people where I just help them like come into their body. So I'm like, feel your feet on the stone where you're standing. Like I usually ask people to walk barefoot unless they really don't want to. But it really helps to be barefoot because you can really get that sensation of your foot stepping onto the line. Yeah. And it's something I still do on highlines. If I get on a highline that's challenging for me and I'm falling and I'm, struggling with the concentration, I also just really like hyper focus on what it feels like as my foot is landing on the line or what it feels like with the breeze blowing past my fingers. And these little, it's kind of like the body scan meditation. It just like brings your awareness to something in your body rather than your thoughts. And so I think it's really helpful for people to start there. Sometimes I work with people on a visualization practice. So, and it doesn't even matter if you're scared or not. I think it's just helpful to visualize not just the experience you want to have, but how you want to react. So I'll like walk people through it, like, picture yourself stepping onto the line, getting your other foot out there. Picture yourself taking a deep breath and letting it out. And now I want you to imagine that you're shaking and you feel like you're losing your balance. And I want you to imagine yourself smiling or laughing about it and taking a deep breath and like and reminding yourself that you're choosing to be here. Because so often we forget that we're choosing the thing that we're doing. And it becomes this big scary thing. I mean, I have to remind myself just running my own business sometimes, like, Faith, you're choosing this.
Exactly.
Well, it was funny the way you describe it because I was watching so many of your videos, and then there was like this little dude. I don't know how old that kid was who just
6 years old.
he cruised right across it. I'm like, okay, this is doable.
He was crying the whole time. It was so fascinating to watch because he was so excited. He walked up to the edge and was like, I'm excited. And then when he was out there, he was crying the whole way across. And his dad had to like talk to him. I was talking to him too, but they're Ukrainian, so his dad was speaking his language. And he was like talking to him the whole way across. And then when he got off, he was happy again. It was like just seeing this like array of emotion, like excitement, terror, 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 excitement.
Do you notice women versus men having a different relationship to fear and through your company, your work with other people?
Absolutely. So I've also run a women's highline festival for 15 years in Europe and Czech Republic. So I do that annually. So already, early on, I mean, I started that the first year I started highlining because there were so few women. I was like, we need more women in the sport. Let's just make our own space. And I noticed women, I think a lot of women struggle with perfectionism and would rather not do something than do it imperfectly. And yes, me too. So I haven't written my books yet.
I really do have a beginner's mindset. I'm much more childlike, and I take that as a big plus to
Fuck yeah.
my characteristics that all make me who I am. But that beginner's mindset is interesting to me because I know I'm not going to be good at knitting or when I first started playing tennis or whatever, that I started running marathons. I was slow as can be, and then I did triathlons. I couldn't swim one length of the pool without gasping for air. And I'm okay with not being the best at things. It's more of a competition with me internally that I started and that I tried and that I did it. And that's where I feel accomplishment.
In my experience working with women, you're kind of a rarity. And this is all anecdotal, like it's not research that I can point to. But I just noticed that, with all the guys I was going out and highlighting with, like so many of them would just throw themselves at it. The thing I would say that women have a strength in is facing emotions. So I feel like and I experienced this guiding. I've had more men refuse to do a thing than women, a scary thing. And my theory about it is that men generally are not taught to be vulnerable, and it's not considered okay or masculine to be vulnerable. And for them to be scared, they're going to have to be vulnerable. And so it's easier for them to just not do it
Walk away.
than to, yeah, exactly. And so I've noticed that, like, I've had women just weep the entire way across the high line or like bawl down the rappel, but they still did it versus like these men would be like, I'm too scared. I want to bypass this. And I would try really hard to get them to do it. And they would just be so, like, put a wall up. And this doesn't happen that often. By and large, almost everyone I take out does the things. But I've just noticed that women seem to be more comfortable, like, having an emotional response to it. I recently took out another guide in town. He's a climber. He's a very accomplished climber. And he's not a highliner, but he slacklines. He has a slacklining background. And he really wanted to try this highline system that I have for people who don't have experience. And I said, okay, come help me carry some gear and like you can get on it. And he couldn't do it. He could not take a single step. And I think it's because he is so used to being in control while climbing. Climbing is what he knows. And on a high line, you don't have that wall of rock in front of your face. There's nothing, just space all around you. And it was just so intense for him, he couldn't get through it. And he ended up coming out with me another time and finally broke through. But it was like as the sun was going down, like an hour went by where he couldn't do it. And he cried. And it was so cool to see because it's just like, I just saw him break through something so intense for himself, this wall in his own body and mind, and it was just like, it's so rewarding for me to like facilitate that too, of like, he finally allowed himself to be vulnerable enough to like go out there and be terrified.
What's been the most challenging experience? If you can look back on one highlight experience that was hard for you.
There's no one line that stands out because I became so accomplished when I was in sort of at my peak of athletic ability. But for me, the biggest challenge was changing my relationship to the sport and no longer identifying my entire worth with being the best highliner in the world. That was by far the most challenging. And still, what changed for me is like in the beginning, highlining was about conquering fear, and then it was about accepting fear and like, being less fearful and like all these things. And then what changed was when I would get on a highline, what replaced fear was all these feelings of who I should be, that I should be this good highliner. And so I couldn't find any joy in highlining anymore because of the expectations that would arise when I would get on a highline again. And it was really challenging. And I would say I'm still going through the process of letting go of that version of myself And perhaps I would like to have kids. And so perhaps when I have kids, I'll finally accept that I'm not going to be the best highliner in the world anymore. But it's like there's probably an extended period of grieving still happening for me, like letting go of being that Faith Dickey. But like there's so much room in my life for other things that I had no room for, like teaching other people and guiding people and maybe writing a book and, like all these things that I also want to do.
Yeah. And that's what came to mind for me
Mm.
as you were talking. I was like, oh, I'm like so excited for you to see as you're making room what emerges for you. That's I get that that's associated with grief. That makes sense. But these new identities
Yeah,
that we
that's
get to
incredible.
create.
Well, it's challenging too because, in our culture, we really put people on pedestals for their achievements. So be it in your job or, any type of career really, like so an athletic career can be the same. You get lots of applaud for these world records or these sort of achievements, and these kind of like less measurable ones aren't as applauded. And so it was, in a way, it was hard to transition out of like that's what I had a claim for, even though I have all this wealth of experience that I still get to use in my career. I'm not the 25-year-old with 10 world records. And so it was hard to let go of that. So more than one line, it was just that transition, I guess.
Just from following you, these last month maybe on social media, you're very passionate. You have like really good insight on systemic issues going on in the world, and you're not afraid to take a stand or have an opinion. And I noticed that you just don't take shit, right? Like when people are commenting
Yeah.
or
The woman has convictions,
yeah,
Tracy.
or even what I would say is even gaslighting, you're like, no.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering, is there any, because you mentioned connecting in with your intuition and what Heather and I like to call capital K knowing, right? Like you know what you know, and you're not afraid to talk about it or have convictions. Is that something that has always been within you, or is that something that's emerged? Meaning being able to be like, no, this is how I feel. This is what I'm witnessing. This has been my experience. This is what I believe. Has that emerged through your relationship with highlining, or is that just
a part of who you are, Faith?
That's a good question. I think some part of it was always with me. I think I definitely come from my family. There's a lot of fiery women in my family. And so I think some part of it is also growing up with a single mom, and who had to do everything, who had to take on the role of a man and a woman. And actually my best friends growing up all had single moms. So I was like kind of in this tribe of single women. And so I think I definitely kind of without any of them talking to me about feminism, I just became a feminist because I witnessed inequality in action and saw these really strong women sort of carrying the load. And so I think I always had some amount of conviction, but I definitely think highlining it gave me a lot of insight into my own ego. And so I had to do kind of a lot of ego work with, I guess I call it ego, but these sort of different voices that popped up when I was on a high line were things I interacted with. So the voice that was telling me I was worthless and bad and I was going to fall, and the voice that was telling me I was a badass and I was so cool and I was amazing and I was more special than everyone. Like these were all just voices of an ego for me. And so I was interacting with them and sort of figuring out which ones I wanted to listen to and which I didn't. And so I wonder if some amount of that aided me in figuring out who I was and my convictions. But I grew up with a strong sense of justice. I was always very into fairness growing up, and unfairness too. I fought a lot with my sister about unfairness.
Right. And could see that with what you lived and witnessed at the Waldorf school and then beyond.
And so also I experienced so much unfairness being a woman in a male dominated sport. I experienced so much sexism constantly and less opportunity by being a woman in a sport that was male dominated. And so I think that also contributed to my convictions because Like, it's easy for me to think, well, if my experiences are real, so are these other people in the world. And so, the online world is so weird too, because it's just one avenue, right? I also, I helped start like an abortion rights advocacy group in Moab, and we raise money for abortion access. And I'm going to DC to protest. Like, I actually take action too. It's not just in social media, but I'm blown away by the constant criticism I receive online for speaking about things that matter to me. And I find it to be such a weird world to live in, where we want people to be pigeonholed into this idea we have of them. And if they step outside of this idea we have of them, like, we need to criticize them for it. It's like we're not allowed to be complete whole human beings. Like, I should just be a slackliner and stick to slacklining. Like, I get so many comments, yeah, like that.
Be more demure.
Yes, exactly. And so it does get to me. I'm not like always just a strong steel shield, especially when it's friends of mine who go into my DMs to criticize me. I mean, it's hard, because it's like, it's people you have a respect with. And so for them to criticize you, it makes me think, like, is there something accurate in what they're saying? So I still go through self-evaluation, but mostly I come back to, like, fuck that. Like, I'm speaking about things that matter, and that's my right.
We need more women like you, and I can relate to that. Being raised by a lot of strong women. I grew up on an Indian reservation in northern Minnesota, and my grandmother used to hold the elections at her home and have her shotgun and pull deer and bucks. Just, I grew up with a lot of really strong Native American women around me. And I've lost friendships over my political convictions over the years, and I've played on both sides of the different spectrum of aisles. And I believe in feminism and equality by all means, and a big advocate of Planned Parenthood. So I applaud you, and safe travels to DC tomorrow, and good luck with all of your ventures that will lead you along your way. You tell the story, and I just think it's so cool, Faith, that you saw someone slacklining in a park in Austin, and then you are like so many other professional athletes, in that you have been to the top of all of those mountains, literally and figuratively. There's probably not much more that you can do. You teach, you have your own company, your own business, and so could you ever have imagined, right, when you just kept showing up at that park and took that one step and felt that awe, that you'd be sitting here today? We were lucky enough to find you again through that really cool immersive experience through Apple Vision Pro. And, now I'm going to go back home tonight and watch it again.
Totally.
From with a different pair of glasses on, with a different set of perspective from you. So thank you for that.